So you want to own a speakeasy. Let's start with the world you'd be buying into. By the middle of the 1920s, in New York City alone, there were somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 of them. Call it 32,000, the number the police like to use. 32,000 illegal bars in one city at a moment when selling a single drink was a federal crime. Work that against the population and you get roughly one hidden bar for every 78 people in the city, more than double the number of legal saloons that had existed before the law shut them all down. Sit with what that means. The government had banned the product, and the product came back at twice the outlets. A glass of watered whiskey that cost the owner pennies sold for most of $1. And the customers, by the way, were breaking no law at all. Under the Volstead Act, it was the seller who was the criminal, never the drinker. So picture the setup. Bottomless demand, a product you could mark up 4, 5, 6 times over, and a room full of paying customers the police couldn't even arrest. By every ordinary rule of business, the person standing behind that bar should have gotten rich. Most of them didn't. Most of them ended the decade broke, or arrested, or shut down for good.
So what was the most expensive thing about owning a speakeasy? Was it the liquor? The stuff you weren't allowed to buy in the first place? Was it the men in uniform you paid every single month? Was it the rent on a room that could be raided at any hour of the night? Here's the part that makes this one worth staying for. It wasn't any of those three. Not really. The thing that actually emptied their pockets was sitting in plain sight the whole time. You just couldn't see it from behind the bar. To find it, you have to follow the whole chain, from the glass in a customer's hand, back past the bottle, past the men paid to look the other way, all the way to the top. So let's start pouring, one link at a time.
Here's the world we're working in. January 1920, the 18th Amendment takes effect, and the Volstead Act gives it teeth. Making, selling, or moving liquor for drinking is now illegal across the entire country for 13 years. And nothing about the thirst changes. If anything, it grows. The saloons close their front doors and reopen in basements, back rooms, and behind fake storefronts, and they call themselves speakeasies because you were meant to speak easy, keep your voice down, and not draw the law. So a whole industry has to be rebuilt overnight in the dark. Someone has to make the liquor, someone has to move it, someone has to pour it, and someone has to keep the police from noticing all three. That's the supply chain, and every supply chain has one question that decides everything. Of all the links in it, which one keeps the money, and which one absorbs the risk? That is the question for today. We're going to walk the chain from the front door of a speakeasy all the way back, one link at a time. The room, the bottle, the envelope of cash that kept the peace. And by the end, you'll see exactly which link the profit pooled in and which link the danger landed on. They were not the same link. They were almost never the same link. And the man behind the bar, the one whose name is on the lease, was standing on the wrong one. Let's start where the customer starts, at the door.
The first thing a speakeasy owner bought wasn't liquor, it was concealment. You needed a room nobody would look at twice, a basement under a laundry, a back parlor behind a lunch counter. And then you spent real money making it disappear. A steel door with a peephole, a password changed often, a lookout, a way, this is the part people forget, a way to destroy the evidence in seconds when the knock came. The most famous of them turned that into an art form. One New York club built its bar over a system of levers. Pull the right one, and the shells tipped, and every bottle slid down a chute and shattered into the city sewer. By the time the agents got downstairs, there was no liquor. There was no crime. The real cellar sat in the building next door, behind a 2.5-ton brick door you opened by pushing a thin rod through one specific brick. That is not the budget of a bar. That is the budget of a bank vault. And here's where it gets strange. That same illegality, the thing costing him a fortune to hide, quietly handed him something no legal saloon in America had ever been allowed to have. Before 1920, the saloon was a men's room, not just by custom. By 1907, there were laws making it illegal for women to be in a space designed for drinking. A licensed saloon that let women in was risking its license, so it didn't. A speakeasy had no license. There was nothing to revoke. It was already breaking the law, so breaking one more social rule cost it precisely nothing. And it opened the door to women. And they came. They drank, they smoked, they danced, and some of them ran the rooms. The most famous host in New York was a woman, Texas Guinan, who greeted her customers by calling them suckers to their faces.
Now put that in the account book. The biggest expansion of the customer base in the history of the American bar, roughly half the adult population, previously shut out, and it cost the owner nothing. The ban handed it to him for free. The cheapest asset in the whole business was the one thing everybody assumed was pure liability. And here is the quiet problem underneath all that spending. Under the Volstead Act, the room itself was the crime. The law declared any place where liquor was sold to be, its exact words, a common nuisance. Not the owner, the place. The four walls you were pouring money into were, legally, a liability the moment you opened. Every dollar of that fit-out was a bet against the government. And a bigger crowd doesn't only mean more money coming in, it means more liquor going out, and every bottle he pours has to be bought from somebody first.
You cannot make your own liquor at any scale and stay quiet about it, so you buy it. And the moment you buy it, you've handed the most important part of your business to someone else. The bootlegger set the price, not you. He controlled the supply, and the supply was scarce and illegal, so he priced it exactly where he wanted. And then he cut it. He took good whiskey or gin and stretched it with water, with glycerin, with whatever would pass, so one honest bottle became 2 or 3 bottles to sell. At the rougher end of the trade, the stretching was done with industrial alcohol, wood alcohol, the kind that didn't just taste bad, the kind that blinded people and killed them by the thousand across the decade. So the owner is buying a diluted product at a price someone else dictates. He marks it up hugely, but the real margin was taken upstream by the man who watered it before it ever reached the bar. And this is where the man behind the bar had his one genuinely brilliant idea, the cocktail. We treat it now as craft. It began as camouflage. Americans before Prohibition mostly drank their liquor straight because it was good enough to drink straight. Bootleg liquor wasn't. So the bars started burying it in fruit juice, in syrup, in sugar, in soda, in mint, in cracked ice. And the new customers coming through that door wanted exactly that, something sweet enough to get past the taste. Look at what that did to the arithmetic. Juice, sugar, and ice cost pennies, and those pennies let him charge more for liquor that was objectively worse. A spirit nobody could stomach neat became a drink he could sell at a premium, in a stemmed glass with a name. And here's the sharpest part. The whiskey wasn't his, the bootlegger priced it. The room wasn't safe, the law had already marked it. But the sugar, the ice, the mint, nobody upstream cared about any of that. The cheapest thing behind that bar was the only ingredient he actually controlled, which tells you something about how little of that business was ever really his. And the danger was his. If a customer went blind in your room, it was your room, your name, your nuisance. The bootlegger was 3 streets away and anonymous. Which brings us to the third link, the one that was supposed to keep him safe.
Every speakeasy owner paid protection, not as an option, as a cost of doing business, like rent or ice. The beat cop was underpaid and easy to reach. A regular envelope, he looked the other way, took a quiet drink, and, if you were lucky, tipped you off before a raid. That part almost worked. And once you see the salaries, you understand why. A federal prohibition agent earned somewhere between $1,200 and $3,000 a year. That's it. The government had built the largest federal law enforcement body in the country, bigger than the FBI at the time, and priced the men in it at less than a busy club took across the bar in a couple of good nights. Some city police on modest salaries were found with $200,000 sitting in the bank, and the results were exactly what those numbers predict. By 1930, the Bureau had fired more than 1,500 of its own people for bribery, perjury, robbery, embezzlement. One of the biggest bootleggers in the country reckoned that half of everything he took in went straight back out as payoffs. And when investigators bugged a meeting of 44 men in his hotel suite, every single one of them was on his payroll.
Which gives us a genuinely strange result. Of everything the owner had to buy, the room, the liquor, the fixtures, the police were the cheapest. The state had set the price of its own enforcement so low that protection was the best value line in the ledger. The problem was never that protection cost too much. The problem was what it didn't cover. Because the envelope to the local police did nothing against the federal agents. A payment to a city cop meant nothing to a treasury man from another district who kicked your door in on a Tuesday. And it did nothing against the other predator, the syndicate. The mob didn't just supply the liquor. In the big cities, it owned the best rooms outright. The most glamorous club in Harlem, the one that defined the whole era, was owned by a gangster. If your independent little place did too well, you didn't get a competitor. You got a visit. And look at the scale of the operation those envelopes were feeding. At its peak, one Chicago organization pulled in something like $100 million a year, over $1 billion in today's money, and spent an estimated $500,000 a month, every month, on bribes, to police, to politicians, to federal investigators. $500,000 a month, in payoffs alone. Your little envelope was one drop feeding that river. You were not a business owner in that structure. You were a tributary.
So, the liquor, the police, the rent. Those were the costs everyone expected. Now here is the one they didn't. The one written into the law on purpose. Remember that the Volstead Act called the room a common nuisance. That word wasn't decoration, it was a weapon. Because a nuisance could be shut down through a civil injunction. And a civil case is not a criminal case. In a criminal trial, the government has to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. For the padlock, it didn't. It only had to show a judge that the place had been used for liquor. That's a lower bar, a much lower bar. And so the government could chain your doors shut for up to a full year without ever convicting you of anything. Read that again. You could be arrested, go to court, beat the charge, walk out a free man, and still come back to find your own front door padlocked shut for the next 12 months by a judge in a case you weren't even the defendant in. The premises were the defendant, not you. And you couldn't move a padlocked building. The lease kept running, the rent kept coming due. The fit-out you'd sunk a fortune into sat dark and useless behind a government chain. Now put the whole ledger together and watch what happens to that fat markup from the opening. The supplier already took the real margin on the liquor. The police and the syndicate took the protection money every month. Every raid dumped your inventory down the drain. Money gone in an afternoon. And hanging over all of it, the constant chance that the room itself, your single biggest investment, could be seized for a year on a case you couldn't even fight as the accused. The markup was gross. What the owner actually kept, after all of that, was thin. Sometimes nothing. The revenue looked like a river, but almost every dollar of it pooled somewhere upstream, with the bootlegger, with the syndicate, with the men taking the envelopes. The owner didn't own the margin, he didn't own the supply, he didn't own the protection. He owned one thing completely, and it was the only thing nobody upstream wanted. He owned the exposure.
So let's answer the question we opened with. Which link in the chain kept the money? Not the one behind the bar. The Speakeasy was never really its own business. It was the storefront of someone else's business. The retail, risk-absorbing front end of a supply chain that was owned and priced and protected from upstream. The man at the peephole took all the visible risk. His name was on the lease. His face was at the door. His inventory hit the sewer in the raids. His building wore the padlock. And for carrying all of that, he was allowed to keep the thinnest slice of the money. When it ended, December 1933, Prohibition repealed, you can see the whole thing in who walked away with what. The operators, mostly, had nothing to show for 13 years behind the bar. But the suppliers and the syndicates had already moved the money on into legal distilleries, into casinos, into real estate, cleaned and legitimate. They'd used the Speakeasy the way water uses a riverbed. It carried the flow. It kept none of it. And if you've been with this channel a while, you know this shape by now. The miner who paid the full cost of the claim before he ever knew if there was gold in it. The Viking crew who rode into the Arrows for a share, while the man who owned the ship owned the risk. It's the same law of the account book, over and over. The person doing the visible, dangerous work is almost never the person who keeps the money. The house always got paid. It just was never the house you were standing in.
If you sat through the whole ledger with me, do me one small thing. Hit subscribe and leave the video a like. It's a tiny envelope, and unlike the ones in this story, it actually protects something. It tells the algorithm to keep these coming. Because next time, we're leaving the basement and crossing an ocean. We're going to open the books of a colonial trading post, a place that looked like it made its money selling goods across a counter. It didn't. The real profit wasn't in what the post sold. It was in who owed it and how long they stayed owing. And once you see how that debt was engineered, you'll never look at a frontier shop the same way again. Until then, keep your eyes on the ledger. It always tells you who really owned the place. This is Owning History, where history opens its account books.